In the late 1970s, a band emerged who, thanks to their thrillingly unique sound and intensely charismatic lead singer, sounded quite unlike anything that had gone before. Joy Division were a Manchester-based four-piece, a quartet of young men whose profound influence on modern music resonates hugely to this day.
It's about suicide, and it's about darkness, and it's about death, it's about emotions, it's about losing control but trying to keep control.
They're actually stunning performances. I mean, when you actually see Ian Curtis moving, the way he dances just was mesmerising.
It was such a shock, such an electrifying experience to see this guy who just wasn't like any rock star you'd seen before. He wasn't posing, he wasn't doing what he thought a frontman should do.
This programme is a review of Joy Division's brief yet startling career, the music they made, and the creative minds that made it. In the summer of 1976, the first rumblings of a new musical movement were making themselves known. Britain was about to be exposed to punk, most notably via the shock tactics of controversial young upstarts, the Sex Pistols.
Mate, you look so bloody boring.
Punk would have been quite astonishing. If you compare it with what else was around at the time, Queen or Pink Floyd or The Who playing huge stadium gigs, to see a band like that who were kind of so original and kind of raw and energetic, and it must have completely blown everybody's mind.
Really up to that point, you know, rock had become quite sort of slick and professional, and here was this punk aesthetic kind of absolutely encapsulated by the Pistols and by their whole kind of iconoclastic attitude. It really spoke to this particular group of disaffected fans and kind of wannabe anti-stars, really.
It was the Sex Pistols' gigs at the Manchester Lesser Free Trade Hall, attended by all the formative members of Joy Division, that really began to ignite creative sparks.
The Pistols were going around the country inspiring people, so when they came to Manchester, I think it was the most impact they'd had in any city, and Manchester became the second city of punk.
The twin gigs at the Leicester Free Trade Hall famously had quite a profound influence on the people who would become Joy Division. The very next day of the second gig, Pete Hutt went out and bought a bass guitar and basically started to learn from that point onwards. But having said that, it wasn't a particularly great gig. There have been books about it, there have been films about it, and it was a fairly mundane gig, to be honest. People didn't pogo as they were portrayed in 24-Hour Party People.
Genius in the story.
While the gig has retained a mythical status, certain elements have been exaggerated over the years. Manchester celebrity Tony Wilson was present, but his then-wife Lindsay Reed, portrayed here by Shirley Henderson, was not.
I was at the Slaughtering the Dogs gig about two weeks earlier, which was similarly punkish, you know. There was a guy, well, Tony remembers he was wearing a dress, and it was definitely wild. Some of it just was horrible. I mean, I remember at the Electric Circus, Tony on stage having beer chucked all over him, and people were gobbing at him, and I was standing at the back thinking, oh, you poor thing, you know. And when he came off, I was going to console him, but he was elated. He thought it was fantastic. But I thought it was absolutely gross and disgusting.
The Sex Pistols show in Manchester clearly was hugely important for the music scene there. Pretty much everyone was there who then went on to form the kind of key Manchester punk and post-punk bands. So you have to say that it was the kind of crucible for the late 70s, early 80s scene in Manchester.
We just caught up in all the, you know, the punk side, you know, let's get playing and all this. After seeing the Pistols, but when we got together really, it was about the Anarchy tour, And it took a hell of a long time for us to get everything sorted out.
Yeah.
And you could see all other groups sort of coming up all the time, you know, so.
The influence of this gig has been known to raise an interesting issue. Joy Division, believed by many to be the epitome of post-punk, actually came together during the height of the original punk phenomenon.
Now, the thing about punk is that it was liberating, but it then almost immediately became something that you had to escape from.
It's a very different kind of punk rock up north. I don't think people wanted to be just like the London scene, which was a certain kind of style and a certain kind of sound. People didn't wear those kind of clothes or play that kind of music up here.
Once you're into 78, punk, in its kind of pure raw form, is already sort of on the way out, and the bands are becoming more musical, if you like, and they're becoming more intellectual, perhaps more cerebral, and just that kind of dole cue, leather jacket, safety pin thing is over.
And I suppose the first truly post-punk band are Suzies and the Banshees, who were kind of inspired by the Sex Pistols to become musicians. And they did a very sort of similar thing to the Joy Division. If you're trying to sort of do something different and you're not trying to play rock music, you often end up with that kind of slightly monotonous, repetitive bass lines and backing tracks that Joy Division started out doing.
Whether Joy Division or Warsaw actually said we are a punk band is irrelevant, really. It's just taking the energy of punk and making something out of it.
An embryonic Joy Division started out in Manchester under the name of Warsaw, and in July 1977, they recorded their first demo tape.
They were kind of very raw to begin with. I think they were one of those bands that developed.
There was no indication at all, really, that something remarkable was going to happen. I don't think anyone could claim that.
What's distinctive about Joy Division isn't immediately apparent with what you hear, what you heard on stage with Warsaw.
Very, very early on, you can hear the roots of what's going to turn into Joy Division, but imagine if you saw them at the time, you'd probably think they were just another two-bit local band trying to play punk rock.
Warsaw's raw and explicitly punk stylings also carried through to the band's next incarnation. Now officially rechristened as Joy Division, the group consisted of singer Ian Curtis, bassist Peter Hook, guitarist Bernard Sumner, nicknamed Barney, and drummer Stephen Morris. It was in June 1978 that they would release their first EP, a 4-track collection entitled An Ideal for Living. Interestingly, the opening track shared the same name as their previous band title.
3-5-0-1-2-5, go! I was there in the backstage when this light came around.
Ideal for Living is... It's good, retrospectively. It's good but not great. Musically, they haven't quite kind of found their sort of space and their kind of rhythm. I mean, they're still bashing out the rhythm in a very conventional, quick-fire 4/4 sort of way.
If that's all they'd recorded, it probably would have just disappeared into the mist of history like 100 other kind of post-punk EPs.
After punk, there's a lot of questions. People are like, what are we going to do with the music? That's what people are thinking. Let's go somewhere else. And people are looking for different ways of making music. The whole thing about punk would be to destroy rock and roll, but obviously that's a complete myth, really. But maybe making rock and roll in different kind of ways, you know, not just the 12-bar.
At the time, they wouldn't really have sounded that special on the basis of that. It's only in hindsight that you can see that, especially if you look at the sort of lyrics where Curtis has kind of, you know, he did find his lyrical voice in lots of ways quite early on, and certain themes are already beginning to develop.
The sound is just not distinctive enough, and it's just too close to, you know, something like The Clash. There's the standard abrasive, chunky sounding punk music.
With no hearing give up the fight, just to live in the past tense, to make believe you were right.
At this early stage, Joy Division's somewhat underwhelming output had been overshadowed by another issue, the controversy surrounding their name. A direct reference to the 1955 novel House of Dolls, Joy Division was a slang term referring to groups of women forced into prostitution by Nazi concentration camp officials.
Curtis, in particular, was fascinated by the Third Reich, not as a sort of closet Nazi, but just in terms of kind of what it represented.
He's fascinated by the Nazis, but it doesn't make him a Nazi just because he's fascinated at how utterly depraved and revolting human beings can get. I mean, it's a fascinating topic. The whole Nazi thing is very interesting, but only because it's the utter dark side of humanity.
You could say it's quite kind of a juvenile fascination in a way. But the imagery was so powerful that these lyrics, which are very, very sort of underrated, it kind of became a metaphor for the sort of feelings he had. He was trying to express, and it was only later that he became sort of deft enough to sort of escape that.
Joy Division, do you know what that is, Mr. Wilson?
It's when the Nazis picked out racially pure women and had sex with them.
Yeah, well, Joy Division, that's us, eh?
Well, it's a very Nazi name.
So?
Yeah, but it's quite cheery as well.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
Joy.
So, yeah, like a division of joy.
I think Ian and Barney did have an interest in Germany because they grew up with air raid shelters in the back garden and things like that. The Second World War was still around in a sense, and Ian loved history, so there was that interest.
I think people forget in the people who grew up in the 50s and 60s that they were kind of force-fed war films. All these images of kind of Nazis in their uniforms, you know, in Spitfires and Hurricanes and Messerschmitts. Every schoolboy had that sort of fascination with the Nazis, and Joy Division weren't any different.
Hi, Hitler! That's better. Now let's see you walk.
It won't work, you know.
Yes, it'll work. Let's see you walk. Put some style into it. Put your hand on your hip. That's what the bloody Boche have, style. Slap your gloves against the leg. Lass mich in Ruhe.
Was starrst du mich an, du Esel?
Heil Hitler! Heil Hitler!
It really was just a juvenile fascination, which they soon evolved from.
Although the band had no fascist leanings whatsoever, it could be said that they were nevertheless playing a dangerous game, one which had the possibility of them attracting a right-wing following.
I think a lot of right-wing people did attach themselves to the bands, but it wasn't like the gigs were like Nazi rallies or anything. But I've met people over the years who've been pretty like revolting people into the right-wing thing who have been fascinated by Joy Division, fairly misunderstood what they were singing about because the music is very, very dark. They have that kind of Eastern European look at their clothes. There's always like this little rumble of this Nazi thing that goes on and on and on behind them all the time, even though it's completely not true.
In a way, they escaped that, in a sense that Madness, a year or so later, didn't. You know, those factions attached themselves to them, and I don't think they ever did to Joy Division to any great extent at all.
With a name like Joy Division, you know, there is always the possibility that you are going to attract some sort of Nazi far-right following, and those people were certainly swilling around at the time. But there was nothing in the music that would have attracted them. I mean, the whole nature of the music was clearly much more kind of sombre and ruminative, and it just wasn't, it was too good for Nazis, you know.
Joy Division, however, were about to enter the next phase of their career. In September 1978, they made their first ever television appearance.
Seeing as how this is the programme which previously brought you first television appearances from everything from the Beatles to the Buzzcocks, would you like to keep our hand in and keep you informed of the most interesting new sounds in the Northwest? This Joy Division is the most interesting new sound we've come across in the last 6 months. They're a Manchester band, with the exception of the guitarist, who comes from Salford. Very important difference. They're called Joy Division.
There was a lot of kind of weird stuff on telly at that time, more so than there is now. I mean, you know, there was the old Grey Whistle Test, and which had sort of fairly avant-garde stuff on it sometimes, and then you even had programmes like Revolver, the punk show was on, where you could tune in and see the Rich Kids and the Skids and all those kind of bands.
That early Granada Reports appearance was the work of Tony Wilson, who in those days was a presenter who was on every single night when you were having your tea, so everybody knew him and all the mothers loved him, and you know, kind of this cuddly presenter. And Ian Curtis famously sort of attacked him at rafters and asked him if he'd put him on.
You a friend of yours?
Yeah, he's our singer.
Oh, hey, Steve.
Hi, Tony Wilson. Pleased to meet you. Is he going to hit me? You're quite close to me there.
Yeah, I know, but I want to be.
Why?
Because you're a cunt, mate.
I know, I heard you the first time.
To the center of the city in the night, waiting for you.
I think that one of the most arresting things that you see is when he does the kind of the epileptic butterfly dance, the trap butterfly dance. It was that dance, I think, that caught most people's eye.
Most British bands don't really do very much, do they? They just kind of stand there and stare at the floor. And of course, the punk bands have been great because they didn't. You know, there's like a really great aggression and great energy to the bands. But here's something very, very different.
Yet Joy Division's appearance here would only mark the beginning of their relationship with presenter Tony Wilson. In the months that followed, they were to become an integral part of his new business idea, a Manchester-based record label.
It was also around that time that Tony Wilson started to think about trying to fight his way back into the record industry and carry on meeting these people that he'd got to know. So the idea of a label sort of came to view at the right time.
Funding the first recording via an inheritance from his mother, Tony Wilson had embarked on the long and twisting saga that the world would come to know as Factory Records. The initial release, a factory sample, was to feature 2 new Joy Division tracks, Glass and Digital.
Digital and Glass, they're very kind of post-punky words in a way, and there's a very sort of terse, nervy quality to those tracks that you can really see them getting away from the slightly more sort of rough-hewn, punkish sort of beginnings.
At first they were trying to just be able to play and get on stage and play something, just play anything. And now they think, wait a minute, we actually got our own sound here. Let's pursue this. Let's see what the logical conclusion of this is. And they start to hit that kind of groove there.
They went in the studio with Martin Hannett, who they knew because he produced the Buzzcocks Spiral Scratch. Other than that, they didn't really know much about him, and he didn't really know much about them, but Hannett changed the sound profoundly.
They are the first instance of Hannett, as it were, kind of superimposing his musical style, his vision of sound on Joy Division.
With Joy Division, he changed this rolling rock drumming sound to a clipped disco beat, which completely changed, added intensity to the sound. The band hated it at the time. They wanted to go down the rock route, but Hannett was absolutely insistent on this.
Digital, I mean, virtually a pop song. I mean, there's almost like a nursery rhyme element to it. It was probably the first thing they did where people stood up and thought, actually, there's something very deeply kind of intelligent and original going on here.
As well as exposing Joy Division to a much larger audience, the factory sample also ensured that Tony Wilson was carving a reputation for himself and his label as one of the most important figureheads of the Manchester and post-punk music scene.
It pains me deeply to say it, but I mean, Tony Wilson, he was kind of a visionary in a bumbling, egotistical, twattish fashion. He was a visionary and a driving force, and he had and still does, a kind of rapacious intellect, and he, I mean, Factory Records, I mean, made Manchester.
You could be the best band in the world, but if you're going around Wigan or somewhere and nobody's heard you, it's pointless, you know. But with Tony Wilson, he could couch in a certain kind of way. He could say to people, listen to this band, and he could explain to people in their kind of terms. He could explain to all the media people in the terms they could understand.
You have to take the overview, you have to see the bigger picture and how Joy Division fitted into what Factory meant. You have to see how important, how Tony Wilson kind of got Ian Curtis and understood Ian Curtis and understood that he was something very different and unique, that I'm not sure anyone else would have got.
Tony actually had a vision then that I think I've only realised now. I mean, he knew that Ian, for instance, was, you know, some like Jim Morrison character.
Touch me. Come on, play with me.
I had no idea about that. I mean, the factory sample to me was just a frippery, really. You know, a creative, fun thing to do, but I didn't think we'd even get the money back. I was surprised when we did.
Joy Division's ascent to stardom continued when, in early 1979, they featured on the cover of the New Musical Express, in a photo shoot which further helped to cultivate the public's image of a moody and disaffected band. In truth, however, many have pointed out the contrast between this image and the reality, that Joy Division was simply a group of friends who enjoyed making music.
One of the remarkable things about Joy Division was how impossible it was to square their image with their actual characters, and indeed square the music with the characters, because they never ever seemed to blend.
Oh, they didn't seem morose and depressing at all. They were a bag of laughs, you know, laughing and joking all the time and playing tricks, and you know, that's how they were.
You would go and say, I got caught them in rehearsal very, very early on, and watched them quite intense rehearsal in Little Peter Street in Manchester, and then they'd go to the pub and they'd be talking about football and the usual things that gang. It was like being with a road gang. You know, there was nothing remotely pretentious about them.
People have been saying, oh yes, about death and doom, but none of the songs though. I don't like. I think it's you know, a heavy metal thing that.
They weren't educated particularly well. They weren't well read. They were just your average gang of lads. Yet somehow when they picked up the guitars, something else happened. They were learning very, very fast, and they're obviously brighter than the educational system had given them credit for, to be honest with you.
This contrast also gives rise to another theory. The Joy Division was simply unconsciously reflecting and channeling the modern world around them.
Well, there is a theory that all music is channeled, and I mean, I personally believe that a lot of it is. You know, some of the words and things come from some other place, don't they?
But it was a dark period there, you know, Thatcher just got in, you know, we thought there was going to be a nuclear war and the world was going to get destroyed. I mean, it's a dark generation, really, you know, people had dark thoughts, and even though maybe I don't think Joy Division ever set out to be spokesman for that kind of feeling, but somehow, unnervingly, they kind of twigged on that feeling that people had.
The sense of, like, you know, the economic policies of Thatcherism actually physically ravaging your kind of immediate environment, it was palpable.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth. Where there is doubt, may we bring faith. And where there is despair, may we bring hope.
Now, if you were to go and talk about all of that to Joy Division at the time, they'd just say, piss off, you know, there's nothing to do with us. And they'd be right in a sense, because they weren't really concerned with monetarism and what was happening in Iran. But that is one of the reasons why Joy Division resonates. It's the times, it's the context they arose from.
It seemed quite colourful and modern at the time. It's an odd thing. Now you think of it in black and white, as you think of Joy Division in black and white. So I think it did colour them. It certainly coloured a lot of those post-punk bands, and Joy Division went along with people like the Pop Group and Pill and those sort of groups who were sort of emerging from a punk sound and had found kind of a dark sound from which to emerge. I think that's fair to say.
Their sound now far more thoroughly developed, it was in May of 1979 that Joy Division released their first album, Unknown Pleasures. Now widely regarded as an experimental masterpiece, the LP nevertheless opened with a relatively straightforward track entitled Disorder.
I've been waiting for a guy to come and take me by the hand. Cure these sensations, make me feel the pleasures of a normal man. These sensations spare the insults, leave them for another day. I've got the spirit, lose the feeling, take the shock away.
It's a pop song. It really is a pop song, and kind of very difficult to play. If you picked up a guitar and tried to sort of do what Bernard's doing, even though it's very, very simple, it's very, very difficult to do well.
They were capable of writing music that would have worked in a stadium, you know, that had that kind of fist-pumping, adrenalising quality, and Disorder certainly has that from the get-go.
Musically, they've established what's very typical of post-punk, established a sort of new space. You know, they're operating in a sort of a spacier dimension.
It's just a fantastically exciting and even danceable track that just announces that Joy Division are here, and stand back and prepare yourselves.
I'm watching you, I watch it all, I take no pity from your friends. Who is right, who can tell, and who gives a damn right now? Until the spirit new sensation takes hold, then you know.
I don't think Joy Division will sit there thinking, let's make this record that's going to mess with people's heads. You know, they're not thinking, let's break the boundaries of music. They want to make a great rock and roll record. Yes, they have this kind of really off-the-wall production to it, and they have this kind of weird, dark aura, which other bands didn't have at the time. But I don't think they were deliberately trying to set out to make this record that was just going to completely, like, do people's heads. And, you know, they wanted people to like the record as well.
Despite this opener, it's only really on the next track, Day of the Lords, that the ambience of Unknown Pleasures really begins to take shape.
Day of the Lords is, by Joy Division standards, quite overwrought, I think. A little heavy-handed, shall we say. I mean, I think it's sort of great on its own terms. It's a bit closer to the kind of theatrics of the Doors than to a lot of Ian Curtis's stuff.
Like a lot of Joy Division tracks, it's covered by this kind of cold film of anxiety sweat. And it was what people were feeling at the time. I mean, a lot of very young people, one of them didn't think they were going to live more than 6 months, not because they were feeling suicidal, but because they thought that the bomb was going to drop.
The recording of this and the other tracks would mark something of a turning point for Joy Division. Far from the chaotic noise of their scattershot live shows, the band could now clearly hear what the others were doing. Ian Curtis's prophetic, doom-laden lyrics were now clear and decipherable.
Violent, more violent, his hand cracks the chair. Moves on reaction, then slumps in despair. Trapped in a cage and surrendered too soon.
In Unknown Pleasures, he was given like a palette, really. I mean, it was his first time in his life that he could actually get his ideas across. And I think he was a little bit frustrated that no one was really listening. You know, maybe that's part of it, because I don't think anybody was, really.
I think Ian's lyrics came from a very troubled and private person. I think he probably hid that side of himself from his band members and the general public. You know, maybe not to his wife or his family. I think that the band they were probably aware that they were producing something really kind of dark and gothic and disturbing in some ways.
Corrupted from memory, no longer the power. It's creeping up slowly, that last fatal hour.
I did see him in rehearsals a few times, and he would have scraps of paper with lyrics written on, and he would come out with a line or something, and the weird thing was, they'd almost bend the music around the lyric. Now, whether this was a one-off or not, I don't know, but that's what they did in front of me. And it was driven by Peter Hook's bass, which was so high, it was almost you know, almost wasn't even a bass, it was bizarre. And he would follow Ian's lyric line with it, and it kind of drive the song, and that happened a couple of occasions.
Most people in bands don't really listen to what the singer's singing about. They're not really that interested, you know, they get their own parts down. And they just, I mean, Hookie's just probably in the studio getting his bass sound as good as it is, and Barney's just constantly guitar. And then when Ian was doing his singing, they'd all go down the pub probably. That's probably the way it is, you know. And they know he's singing about heavy stuff, but they don't really totally understand it. I mean, intellectually they could understand what he's singing about, but I just think they're not interested. They know it sounds really good, and it's got a real kind of vibe to it, and it fits with their music.
Ian was one of the lads, so he was capable of being as laddish as Hookie. But then he was off, like, writing these extraordinary lyrics.
It was not only the lyrics that were becoming more defined. The rest of the instrumentation was clearly evolving too.
You got Peter Hook, who's playing this kind of bass in this very sort of low-slung way, and he's having to carry the burden of the melody a lot of the time. Much as in real life, he felt like he was the one sort of practical one, you know, the ox, the anchor. He was having to do a lot of the kind of practical, heavy work within the band.
Hookie couldn't play guitar, so he played bass, but Hookie's a very forceful person, so he's not going to play bass in the background. And influenced by, like, J.J. Bennell, the Stranglers, he pushed the bass up front, and he played in a very belligerent, macho style, but at the same time, Hookie's got a very sensitive side to him. Barney was a really interesting guitar player. He had a very interesting kind of style. A lot of it's kind of lead rhythm, just chugging along, and had this kind of weird kind of tone as well. It wasn't like big power chords like most of punk bands was. It was kind of this very kind of middly, kind of like almost dead sound. It's kind of sound. It sounded like it's played through the worst equipment, but somehow it sounded really good, especially on Unknown Pleasures, where his place in the mix is really interesting.
His guitar contributions are like sort of acid splashes strewn about, you know, within the songs. Then with Stephen Morris, he brings a certain sort of lightness. You know, his drumming tends to sort of comprise these very sort of cyclical patterns. It's very similar to the sort of thing that Jackie Lieberside did in the German group Can.
These continual leaps forward, however, cannot be ascribed purely to the band. Joy Division had recorded Unknown Pleasures with producer Martin Hannett, who was determined to continue his development of their sound, whether the group liked it or not, an approach particularly noticeable on tracks such as Insight.
One of Martin Hannett's tricks is to separate the music, separate the instruments, and also separate the musicians physically. Which sounds really funny, but he had this thing about recording one at a time and not having anyone else in that control room.
I seem to remember the band whenever in the control room, it was always, you know, I mean, me and Tony would sit in there, Martin would be there with Chris Nagel, and the band would be playing pool downstairs or something.
They'd ask him stuff, and he'd say, "Fuck off," you know, because you know he was making this record. They were merely the musicians who were doing that. It's like he was the factory owner, and they were the kind of drones.
Stop! Hey, stop! Fucking retard! You wear it very well.
What?
You wear it very well. Now play like a fucking musician.
Fucking prick.
I can only imagine that they expected to hear something that was a bit closer to the Stooges and the Velvet Underground or the MC5 or something. They wanted more of that kind of guitar attack, and really it's to Martin Hannett's credit that he saw that there was a way of producing this band that made them sound like some sort of dystopian disco.
If you have a production aesthetic, it's going to make a record kind of more exciting, I think, or give it extra dimensions that you wouldn't if you just tried to record a band just as they sound in a room.
I mean, I think the real templates are some of the krautrock bands, some of the Neu records, for example, and I think some of Eno's records. To me, that is pointing the big finger towards Joy Division.
Another song which Hannett moulded into something new, and one of Joy Division's best-known moments, was She's Lost Control. Perhaps the closest that Ian Curtis ever got to musically portraying the effects of his often debilitating epileptic condition.
Yes, it's really unusual, musically unusual, and again, it's kind of Peter Hook's playing the bass like it's the kind of main melodic instrument, which is quite interesting.
I think it's the most instantly powerful track on the album. It's not my favourite track on the album by any means, but on first listen and second listen, that is the track that stood out. There's no doubt about that, really, mainly because of that diving bass, which is so it's such a remarkable thing to hear for the first time.
It creates this extraordinary kind of equation between the sort of spasmodic effects of an epileptic fit and the kinds of dancing that Ian Curtis would do on stage, and particularly to that track.
Someone I spoke to called Alan Wise, he thinks that Ian was actually drumming himself up into an epileptic fit with the dance, with the dancing, and of course the strobe light certainly didn't help. I don't know about that. I don't know. I mean, I think it was just part of who Ian was, and who he was remains actually a bit of a mystery.
Just thinking about something, you can actually show it as well. You know, like, there's no need to just sort of sing it there. You can actually put it over the way it is. If you're totally involved in what you do.
Curtis is obviously, from a very early age, quite a disturbed individual. To then have that upset with an illness like epilepsy must have created in his own head a very kind of strange situation.
People thought it was Ian Curtis probably hinting at his epilepsy, but he always claimed it was about, because he used to work in an epileptic unit in Macclesfield, and he claimed it was about a girl there who had epilepsy. And in fact, this is what, when he finally got epilepsy himself, it's what created the fear and the panic for him, because he's seen like really extreme bad case of epilepsy in Macclesfield, and he thought that was his fate.
It had a huge effect on Ian personally, and I think he possibly felt that he couldn't see how he could go on with it, because the fits were increasing, and you know, he was having them on stage more and more, or towards the end of the set. So I think possibly he wondered how he could go on with it.
Following She's Lost Control on the album is Shadowplay, a song which fuses elements of gothic rock, heavy metal and punk, demonstrating just how difficult to categorise Joy Division could be.
to the center of the city where a roads meet.
Shadowplay was probably the most influential track that Joy Division recorded, actually, because it's the one song that you can hear right across the border, I think, from it's fair to say, from that sound. As I said before, gangs like the Pop Group, Gang of Four, Pill, Scutability, all those people have cited Shadowplay, strangely, as a guiding influence. I think it was. I mean, it's a very easy and accessible track, and it's atmospheric without being too deep, really.
The line about acting out your own death, I mean, it still sends a chill down my spine, because even saying those words, I mean, there's something really powerful and dark and disturbing and fascinating and alluring about that track. I mean, it's an absolutely fantastic piece of music.
While lyrically, you know, Curtis doesn't sort of stray very far from his kind of particular territory. Musically, it does. There is that almost that kind of inherent underlying element of machismo in Joy Division, that desire to rock out. There was a vivacity about Joy Division. I think that's one of the things that comes out even in a song like Shadowplay.
The atmosphere of Unknown Pleasures was reflected perfectly by the cover artwork, a Peter Saville piece depicting a radiograph of a dying star.
It's one of the most iconic sleeves of all time is Peter Saville's Unknown Pleasures cover. I mean, it's his favourite piece of artwork he's ever done for himself, and he's done some great stuff, but it's just an absolutely awesome cover.
They were really getting away from rock and roll as sort of phony romance.
I think they were one of the first bands to kind of use minimalist sort of artwork in a very, very stylish way. I remember sort of never seeing anything like it before. I didn't really understand what was going on, and I certainly didn't understand sort of his influences. But it was kind of all very new and exciting.
Unknown Pleasures received widespread critical acclaim upon release. The band, however, were not feeling so jubilant. The increasing severity of Ian Curtis's epilepsy meant that they had to call a temporary halt on public appearances. They would next be heard from in October, with the inclusion of a new track on compilation Earcom 2. Autosuggestion would see them further embracing an electronic aesthetic.
All of a sudden, the band were talking about dub techniques, which was very, very lo-fi, and they were just experimenting in the studio, and they were evolving on a daily basis with unbelievable speed.
In a few months, they're moving further and further away from a more traditionally rock-based sound, and they're looking at something a bit more experimental, a bit more rhythm-based, and yeah, maybe even touch the Kraftwerk with the keyboards coming in. And Kraftwerk have always been a very big influence in Manchester. I mean, the most unlikely people here are really into Kraftwerk.
That whole electro-pop thing hadn't happened yet. So, you know, they were always sort of musically innovative. and you know, and not always necessarily, you know, succeeding.
Innovation seemed like everything, but to an extent, perhaps to the detriment of the songs to some extent, because suddenly it became like a big scramble for sound techniques, which was part of what post-punk was about, because these people had picked up guitars during the punk era, and they'd finally learned to play them, and they were moving another stage.
The experimentation of auto-suggestion would be followed by a track which seemed to revert to Joy Division's punk-based roots. Their next single, Transmission.
Transmission was a step backwards, but then again, every single thing they recorded was. So everything recorded was retro, because they were 6 months ahead of what they were recording, and they were frustrated by this. Because the stuff they were doing in rehearsals was on a different league to the stuff that they were recording. They had to catch up somehow.
It's important to remember that they could just rock out with the best of them, but it's also like a dance record, and it obviously culminates in the whole kind of refrain of, you know, dance, dance, dance.
In a sense, it is actually one of the most energised songs. I mean, it contains as near, and albeit in a very heavily qualified way, it contains as near as you get to a sort of positive sentiment.
And we could dance, 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 dance to the radio. Dance, 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 dance to the radio.
It was quite extraordinary. I mean, when they played it on Something Else, which was the BBC Two kind of youth programme, I think that's probably the largest audience they ever had in terms of a television audience.
Dance, dance, dance to the radio. Dance, 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 dance to the radio.
Joy Division entered 1980 by heading out on a European tour. As with before, they would have to cancel several dates due to Curtis's deteriorating health. Their next recorded material would arrive in March in the form of one of their best-known songs, a kaleidoscopic sonic leap entitled Atmosphere.
Most beautiful things that Joy Division and Hannett created together, and to me, you know, one of the major influences on Martin Hannett as a producer obviously is Phil Spector, as sort of filtered through, you know, krautrock and Eno. The very rhythm of it harks back to the great sort of Spector girl group records, and then that kind of shimmering, cascading sort of waterfall thing. Also, I think, kind of takes you back to that era.
Wonderfully awfully sort of elegant feeling about it, with the synthesizer sort of fanning out like a peacock's tail.
If you've got like a very strident sound, where do you go next? And they've found their escape route here. They've found a sound that was a lot less in your face, but had this same kind of emotional power to it.
I think Atmosphere, it has to be said, is one of those songs that you kind of can't forget the first time you heard it. You know, a strange sort of sensation went through you when you heard those chimes, which to this day makes, I think everyone would agree, it makes you feel kind of, takes you to a slightly different place.
If Atmosphere is held as one of Joy Division's finest moments, their next single would be the one which has since launched itself into the mainstream consciousness. An instantly recognisable pop melody by the name of Love Will Tear Us Apart.
To have written those kind of lyrics and you know, it's so sort of tender and it's so kind of like sorrowful and it's so sort of heartfelt, yet written in a very kind of poetic way.
In hindsight, many have taken this to be Curtis's most personal song, drawing parallels between the lyrics and the turmoil he was feeling at the time due to an extramarital affair.
Ian Curtis was going through emotional stress at the time. He'd met a Belgian girl. He was torn between Deborah, his wife, and Anique, the Belgian girl. He was torn between life at home with Deborah and his daughter and life as a rock star. All these kind of things you can build into that song.
I think people can very easily side with the wife, and I don't blame them. You know, she had a young baby, and it must have been terrifically hard, but I think Anique has been unfairly treated as well.
I don't think enough has been said about how difficult it was for him to handle that. He didn't handle it very well at all, and he couldn't speak about it very clearly, but I think it was a big reason why he killed himself. I think he felt extraordinarily guilty and confused about what he really wanted, and so that song is all about that for me.
People have talked about Sinatra in Love Will Tear Us Apart. His voice, it had that quality. I mean, it was very enchanting and spellbinding, and it had the effect that you felt you were being imparted with wisdom, even if you weren't.
Don't worry about me. I'll get along. Forget about me. Be happy, my love.
To be honest with you, if I never heard that song again, it's too soon, because it's so played at the time and subsequently. It's been so played to death.
Love Will Tear Us Apart is one of those songs, isn't it, like Stairway to Heaven or Smells Like Teen Spirit, which has just become detached from its original context, and it's become a sort of untouchable.
It is a really pretty pop song. It's a really great pop song, and it's their only top 20 hit. And for most people, it's a song that they know by Joy Division without knowing the whole story of the band or the situation or where Ian Curtis's head was at the time that song was written.
With their partially abandoned tour over with, Joy Division stepped back into the studio with Martin Hannett to begin work on their second album. Closer, released in August 1980 after Curtis's death, would be the result. The contrast to Unknown Pleasures was immediate. While the previous album had opened with the relatively simple Disorder, Closer began with a dense, sprawling epic entitled The Atrocity Exhibition.
The Atrocity Exhibition is a very strange opener, no doubt about that, with all kinds of things going on in there, almost kind of rock and beats and things going on which you just didn't expect at the time.
It shows you how they could afford to experiment at time. I think that they already knew they were a great band and they were destined to do great things.
This is really good. This is a sign of a band that's really, really pushing hard.
This is the way, step inside. This is the way, step inside. This is the way, step inside. This is the way, step inside.
The track is also a good indicator of where Curtis's literary influences lay, taking its title from a novel by transgressive fiction writer J.G. Ballard.
Ballard, like William Burroughs, was clearly a major influence on Curtis. As a writer of sort of dystopian futurism, really.
Faraway place, meet the architects of law face to face. See mass murder on a scale you've never seen, and all the ones who try hard to
probably the one track that contains clues of where Joy Division might have gone after Closer, I think. And you can hear that in the Atrocity exhibition, which is a long, long way from Unknown Pleasures, as far as you could possibly get, I think.
The unconventional rhythm of Atrocity Exhibition is followed on the album by the more accessible yet heavily synthesized Isolation.
Isolation, on one level, is quite danceable. It's quite sort of synthy, quite poppy almost. And yet, you know, here's Ian Curtis singing about, you know, profound loneliness. It's almost tongue-in-cheek, that song, you feel.
Despite the synthesized sound, Isolation remains a good example of how little Joy Division's essentially timeless work has dated.
They have dated well because people aren't really making those kind of records anymore. I think Isolation is a great example of that. But also I think it's because when people made electronic music, and quite often at that time, it was a sort of gesture to do, and it quite often denoted a sort of anxiety about the future. Nowadays, when people use synthesizing records, you know, we're in the future now, and this is what we do, and it's very much more routine. It doesn't signify as much. So I think for that reason, tracks like Isolation really do stand up.
You can instantly hear that 80s stuff anywhere, and it sounds great, but in a nostalgic way. Joy Division don't sound nostalgic, it still sounds fresh. I mean, Isolation sounds fresh today as it did then.
I think any record that's got like a really genuinely powerful emotional kick to it can never go out of date, because those feelings that Ian Curtis was singing about are feelings that people have now, they'll have in 100 years' time.
As the album progresses, the development of the band and their relationship with Hannett is reflected in a good deal of the innovative sounds they were creating.
It doesn't sound like a punk album, it sounds like a brand new album for the 80s. I think a lot of bands in the 80s just took their whole sound from that record.
It just sounded hauntingly beautiful. I remember the first time we heard it as a piece, and I couldn't believe. But unfortunately, at the time with the suicide attempt that Ian had made, when in fact driving to the hospital to visit him, we played the cassette for the first time in the car, you know, in its entirety. And I just thought it sounded amazing.
Closer is a very dense album, much far more dense than Unknown Pleasures, and certainly more accomplished in terms of musicality and Hannett's recording techniques.
It is the complete Joy Division album in terms of like the execution, musically, lyrically, in terms of the production.
There's an emotive heart to Closer that is probably unparalleled. I can't think of anything anywhere near that.
The culmination of this development can be heard clearly on the track 24 Hours, a song which many see as Joy Division's defining artistic moment.
So this is permanent, love shattered pride. What once was innocent, turned on its side. A cloud hangs over me, marks every move, deep in the memory.
When you're looking at Joy Division in their more sort of anthemic, surging, powerful mode, then 24 Hours is, you know, is right up there in the kind of top 5.
There's a sense musically and lyrically of Curtis sort of crawling to the precipice and then finally, you know, there's nothing there at all.
It's so intense. I just think it's absolutely thrilling. So yes, you have to say it's one of their real peaks.
Oh, how I realized how I wanted time, but into perspective, try so hard to find.
It's not hugely melodic, but it's still entrancing. And I think that kind of summed up what they were doing with that album. I mean, there aren't pop songs on that album, but what there is on there is very, very kind of compelling.
As a posthumous release for Curtis, Closer has since been shrouded in an air of finality, something which is further reinforced by Peter Savile's album cover.
The band turned up at his studio in London and basically said to him, "What? You know, got any ideas for the new sleeve for Closer?" Savile didn't have no ideas whatsoever. But he had been looking at a magazine that day, which featured some beautiful photographs of a graveyard in Italy. These tombstone images that he put in front of the band and showed them, the band, and they edged towards it, and all of them nodded their heads and went, "Perfect for Closer, perfect," including Ian Curtis. Nobody really knows what was going through Ian Curtis's mind at that point, because that album came out after his death, of course, after his suicide. And it was only like a couple of days after when Savile realised that there was a tombstone going to appear on the cover of Closer.
You look at the cover of the album and it just says Closer, and you see the kind of mausoleum in Genoa in the photograph. Then to me, it really is about, it just says you're talking about something, you're talking about moving closer to death.
I think Sam was very, very good at coming up with sleeves, at catching the music, even though he never actually heard the records. You know, obviously he'd seen Joy Division early on, then he knew what they're about, but he never actually heard the albums, he just made the artwork.
Before Closer was officially released, the band had been given 2 weeks in early May to prepare for an upcoming American tour. While this idea excited the other band members, Ian Curtis, now becoming gradually more unbalanced, found the notion profoundly upsetting.
I think he was fed up with the idea of being a rock star, and I think part of him had decided that this would be his last record with Joy Division.
I'm telling you now, straight up, we're going to tour America.
Nice one.
Fuck. Are you serious?
Nice.
I just told you, straight up, we're going to tour America.
Yeah.
Oh, come on,
boys. Fucking cheers. We're going to the US of A. Cheers. Cheers.
I can't fucking believe
I thought you'd like that, boys.
Are we going to be staying in like top-class hotels?
Well, actually, you're in knocking shops and I'm in five-star hotels.
Suits me fine. I think we did better there.
I can't see Joy Division making it in America, really, no. I mean, there's something so quintessentially English and European about Joy Division, you know. But there's nothing that's American about them, despite the influences of Lou Reed and Iggy Pop and so forth on Curtis. You know, it's more Lou Reed in Berlin and Iggy Pop in Berlin and David Bowie in Berlin.
On May 18th, 1980, Curtis was alone in his house. He reportedly watched Werner Herzog's Streuzek and then listened to Iggy Pop's The Idiot. He then went into the kitchen and hanged himself.
Ian's death shocked me completely, and I didn't think that it was going to end with that. I thought it was just beginning.
Rock and roll is all about being young and leaving a beautiful corpse, etc., which is complete bollocks, actually. You know, there's nothing wrong with getting older and getting some wisdom, you know. And Ian Curtis's great hero, Iggy Pop, is probably doing some of the best gigs he's ever done in his whole career, and the guy's only 60. I mean, to me, that's the ultimate act of rock and roll rebellion.
I don't think he was fascinated with the idea of dying young. I think he believed that he would. And he mentioned it not just to Debbie, but also to his family. His mother and aunt and sister knew about it as well. You know, he would just say things, not in a doomy way, but he'd say, you know, I won't be around.
This guy was on the edge of death, and he knew it when he was making those records, and that, you cannot deny, that adds a certain sort of edge to everything, you know, everything Joy Division did.
There is something pernicious in it. I think there's a huge investment in the Western world in self-destructive young men. We need to have these tragedies acted out for us, you know, because we want to imagine what it must be like without actually having to do it ourselves.
Despite the devastation caused by Curtis's death, the remaining band members refused to give up their musical inclinations and, in a remarkable show of defiance, it would not be long before they were touring and recording again. Joy Division, along with new member Gillian Gilbert, had now become New Order, one of the most influential electronic bands of the last 20 years.
You know, they were kids, really, and one of their best friends killed himself. I mean, that's pretty bad. How were they going to react? I don't know. I mean, getting on with it was probably the best thing to do, and probably the only thing they could do.
I was ready to cave in and completely give up. I mean, I just thought, forget it now. You know, this is the absolute worst. You don't carry on with anything when something like this has happened. But they did, and they actually performed a gig quite soon afterwards. But I think it was about...
There, even in the shiniest sort of electro-pop stuff they did, there's this sort of essential Mancunian melancholy that just gets me.
You can still hear a lot of echoes of Joy Division in New Order. I mean, you put Blue Monday on, yeah, it fills up the dance floor, and in the middle of the early New Order gigs, they weren't massively different from the late Joy Division gigs, apart from the fact there's one very charismatic person not on the stage. But there's music-wise, it's a continuation. I mean, they're writing the music, aren't they? So the continuation is there already.
Even with the phenomenal success of New Order, Ian Curtis's spectacular cultural legacy has never been forgotten, inspiring legions of new bands, artists, writers, and even, in some part at least, high-profile movie productions.
Hi, I'm Tony Wilson, and this is the trailer for 24-Hour Party People. It's the incredible but true story of the man behind the scene that defined a decade.
Who is this man?
This is not about sex, drugs and rock and roll.
Tony.
Although they are in it.
In 2006, if you're looking for the influence and legacy of Joy Division, then it's kind of everywhere. A whole swathe of bands in Britain, from the Killers, the Editors, Snow Patrol, you can go on forever.
In a very kind of poetic way, but make it into great rock and roll as well at the same time. So it can work as a great rock and roll song, but it can work as a great piece of poetry as well. And I think maybe that's their greatest lasting legacy.
I think there's something very, very special about Ian as a person. You know, I think he really, really was a special guy.
Gone to the darkness.